Sorry about that. I just realized that I was on mute. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 77th commemoration of the Neckba. This is titled Neckba 77, Reaffirming Palestinian Return and Liberation. My name is Tarek Khalil, Education Coordinator with American Muslims for Palestine, AMP. Before I introduce our two powerhouse panelists, I wanted to lay the backdrop for this webinar. The Neckba is a term that means catastrophe in Arabic and is sometimes used to refer to the events of 1948. But in fact, that's when it began. The Neckba is an ongoing project. And as I speak, we are witnessing its worst form in Gaza. Therefore, the Neckba represents the accumulated Palestinian experience since 1948. And definitionally, the Neckba is the ongoing forcible displacement, ethnic cleansing, land theft, and systematic oppression of the Palestinian people. It is impossible to divorce the Neckba conceptually, historically, politically from Zionism, because it can only be understood in the context of Zionism's enduring theme of settler colonialism. But we must be mindful of the fact that the Neckba is not merely a humanitarian experience, but is in fact characterized by the shattering of Palestinian society, the destruction of Palestine's landscape, and fragmentation of the Palestinian people. But also something else happened. In a contradictory way, the Neckba led to the crystallization and consolidation of a shared national consciousness, bringing Palestinians in the diaspora with those living within the bounds of historic Palestine together. So while Palestinians are dispersed, disintegrated, fragmented, stateless, homeless, denationalized, facing different levels of subjugation, denial, and oppression. Even with all of that happening, the Neckba is a term that binds us as one people in our pursuit for justice, freedom, and liberation. And so the Neckba is not a history of only the past, but also a history of the present. And now we get to our panel. I want to thank Josh Ruebner and Zarefah Baroud for joining us and bringing their expert insight into this. Josh Ruebner is an adjunct lecturer in Georgetown University's program on justice and peace. He just recently obtained his PhD, and his dissertation is entitled, quote, A Tragedy of Catastrophic Proportions, the United States and the Palestinian Neckba, 1947 to 1949, which we plan to talk a little bit about. Mr. Ruebner currently works as the policy director of the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project. Zarefah Baroud is a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter, European Center for Palestine Studies, and is the AMP Digital Media Coordinator. Thank you both for taking the time to be here on the 77th commemoration of the Neckba. Josh, I want to start with you. You're putting the final touches on your dissertation, and you focus specifically on this critical period from 1947 to 1949. So I'm curious to know what factors drove U.S. policy specifically right before the height of the Neckba period and during this very critical period from 1947 to 1949.
Thank you so much, Tarek. Thank you, AMP, for hosting me as part of this important webinar to commemorate the 77th anniversary of the Neckba. Before I get into that, Tarek, I'll just say a word about how I got this title for my dissertation and my upcoming book of the same name, A Tragedy of Catastrophic Proportions. This was actually the direct words that were put into a diplomatic cable by the first ever U.S. ambassador to Israel, a fellow by the name of James McDonald, who is extremely pro-Zionist in his orientation. Yet even someone such as him, with his ideological proclivities, understood the catastrophic nature of what was happening to Palestinians during the Nakba and reported back to Washington in great detail. So I took that quote from Ambassador McDonald to be the title of my dissertation, to show how even people who were very antagonistic to the Palestinian people nevertheless recognized just how grave a situation was created through the Neckba. So you asked, Tarek, what were the factors that led to US policy formulation toward the Palestinian people during the Neckba, especially the years 1947 to 1949? I think that there were three key factors that were drivers of US foreign policy and Truman administration policy. One was the overarching nature of the global, worldwide Cold War struggle that was then in its intense infancy. And so the United States was trying to combat the Soviet Union in all areas of the world. And obviously, confronting the Soviet Union in the Middle East was a primary motivating factor of US foreign policy during these years. And this was meant to both advance US interests, which the US defined as maintaining its access to the region's oil resources and also to military bases, and also preventing the penetration of the Soviet Union into the region. So anything that promoted instability in the region was considered unwarranted by the United States. So the United States was very, very concerned that the creation of Israel would lead to instability in the region and thus be a negative drawdown on US interests there. That was one factor. A second factor was obviously the intense Zionist organizing that took place in the United States at that time to advocate for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. This is something that's well covered in the academic literature, and I'm sure comes as a surprise to no one here in the audience. But that pressure was coming on the Truman administration from members of Congress on Capitol Hill, pressure in the media. For example, The Nation, which we today view as a publication that's very, very supportive of Palestinian rights, was actually hugely supportive of Zionism in those days and wrote memos and pamphlets advocating for the establishment of a Jewish state against the wishes of the indigenous Palestinian people. The third factor contributing to US policy, which I think is the most interesting one, was the ideational factors that went into this policy. In other words, the ideas that animated US foreign policy in the post-World War II period. The United States played the leading role in setting up all of the international institutions that we've come to recognize as different bedrocks of our modern day international system. So that includes taking a leading role in establishing the United Nations, for example. And if you look at the UN Charter, the very first article of the UN Charter talks about how self-determination and equality of all peoples are the cornerstone of the international order in the post-World War II order. The United States also played a big role in setting up the International Court of Justice, played a large role in helping to write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, helped advocate for the writing and the passage of the Convention to Prevent Genocide, and also took a key role in writing and supporting the Fourth Geneva Conventions meant to protect civilians in times of warfare. All of these things were put into place by the United States because the United States wanted to prevent the horrors of World War II from being repeated. And what especially informed this worldview was the experience of Jewish people under Nazi genocide of Hitler and his regime during World War II and the Holocaust. So that was very much front and center in the minds of US policymakers, which meant that in the after-war years, the years that we're talking about for the Neckba, these issues were very, very front and center and taken very seriously by US policymakers, especially the principle of self-determination. So Tarek, in the preparation, you asked me to share a few examples of what I found most surprising about US policy as I researched it during the Nakba. And I'm going to share with you all 5 examples of what I found to be the most interesting, noteworthy, undercovered aspects of this story. Number 1 is the degree to which the United States and policymakers in the Truman administration, including the president himself, actually seriously grappled with the question of Palestinian self-determination. So there were a lot of debates within the Truman administration about whether it was just, whether it was moral to support the recommendation to partition Palestine against the wishes of the majority indigenous Palestinian inhabitants of that land. And actually, some of the strongest memos that were written by Truman administration officials who argued that partitioning Palestine against the wishes of its inhabitants constituted a flagrant violation of their self-determination, and that partition could not be imposed upon the Palestinian people against their will. So we begin to see how the United States has buyer's remorse for voting in support of the Partition Plan recommendation as early as 1 month after the vote took place. A lot of the historiography talks about how the United States played a role in helping to switch votes in support of partition. But what's less understood is that the United States came to a realization in December 1947 that partition could not be implemented without the consent of the Palestinian people. And therefore, they started to second guess the decision, leading in March 1948 to the Truman administration actually revoking its support for partition. This is an undertold portion of the story. The second example that I want to share with you about what I found to be most interesting about the documents that I uncovered in my research was the degree to which the United States did not at all agree with the Neckba, even as they saw it taking place on the ground. In fact, the United States opposed the violence that Israel was inflicting against Palestinians and Zionist militias before the establishment of the State of Israel as well. The United States never supported Israel's dispossession of Palestinians. It never supported turning them into refugees and refusing to allow them to return home. In fact, the opposite was true. So unlike what we're seeing today, when the Biden administration and the Trump administration over the past year and a half of genocide have delivered $30 billion of weapons to Israel, the Truman administration actually slapped an arms embargo on Palestine and then Israel from December 1947 all the way up to 1950. So the United States did not provide a single bullet to Israel to commit the atrocities of the Neckba. And the Truman administration tried to stop Israel's territorial aggrandizement. In fact, it either sponsored or supported, I think, 11 different attempts in the United Nations Security Council to pass a resolution for a truce, a ceasefire, an armistice, mediation, all of these many, many attempts to stop the violence and the ethnic cleansing that was taking place. And we can compare and contrast that to the Biden administration's shameful record later. And it's often forgotten that the United States actually advocated for Palestinian refugee repatriation. The United States supported in the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194, which called for the right of Palestinian refugees to return. And for many, many months in 1949, the United States vehemently told Israel that it had to repatriate at least 250,000 Palestinian refugees in order for there to be any progress toward a peaceful resolution. So this degree of US objection to Israel's actual dispossession of Palestinians during the Neckba surprised me. Number 3, another example of what really surprised me in the archives was the level of granularity, the level of detail at which the United States saw and understood what was taking place. And not only the details, but they understood the intentionality behind Israel's policies. So let me say a bit about both. You don't think of diplomatic archives as containing stories relating to individuals. You think about it kind of on this grand meta-historical level. So I was very, very shocked to find in the archives many, many stories of dual Palestinian American citizens who faced dispossession during the Neckba, whose properties were looted, and who turned to the US government for help in restoring their properties and their homes. I think about this example of a fellow by the name of Isa Saba, who lived in Jerusalem, whose family's home was looted. And it goes into the details about all of the different appliances that were stolen by the Zionist forces in that neighborhood. It goes to that level of detail. I remember reading these stories about Evelyn Jabara, who was born in the United States and married to a Palestinian. She was also a dual Palestinian American citizen. And she wrote all of these detailed letters about how her husband's medical practice was ransacked by Israeli troops in April of 1948 in Haifa, how all of their medical office equipment was stolen, how Israeli soldiers came in and occupied the apartment building that they owned. And believe it or not, I even found an itemized list of more than 100 Palestinians from the village of Tarshiha, which is in the Galilee, in the north of the country, who were ethnically cleansed from their homes in that village well after armistice agreements had ended the interstate nature of the fighting. And it detailed out all of the names, the ages, the occupations, and all of the areas to which these more than 100 Palestinian villagers from Tarshiha were exiled to. And I found in that list of names ancestors of colleagues. So this level of granularity and detail and realizing the human impact of the Neckba from the US diplomatic archives was not something that I expected. And that really lends a human face behind these sort of grand historical events that we talk about sometimes in detail. And I want to mention a word about how the US diplomats on the ground and really throughout the region recognize the intentionality behind what Israel was doing. They understood that Israel was trying to drive out the maximum number of Palestinians from as much of historic Palestine as possible in order to create the largest possible and most homogenous possible Jewish state. And they were abhorred by what they saw and what they reported back to Washington. Another thing I was surprised by in the archives, because Palestinians are often written out of their own history, as we know, this form of historical erasure parallels Zionism and Israel's attempt to physically erase the Palestinian presence from the land. So it's no surprise that Palestinians are often written out of this history as well. One thing that I was surprised by was really the depth and the richness of the argumentation that Palestinians made on their own behalf in front of international organizations, including the United Nations, including the Palestine Conciliation Commission in 1949. These are really lost records that for the most part are glossed over by historians, but I found such forceful presentations of the justness of the Palestinian cause and the immorality of partitioning Palestine against the wishes of the majority Palestinian population. These appeals, pamphlets, speeches before the United Nations could be dusted off of the shelf today and be used to brilliantly describe the situation of apartheid and imperial control that exists between the river and the sea today. It's so relevant today to this discourse. So part of what I insisted on doing is rewriting this Palestinian history into the narrative. And finally, let me close by saying, if I can have one more minute, please. The fifth example of what I was surprised by, because I don't want to leave you with too much of a rosy picture, because the United States did engage in patterns of behavior that I found so surprising, because it really set the precedent for the ways in which the United States fails to crack down on Israel. So I'll give you just one quick example. As I mentioned before, the United States said, Israel, you must repatriate at least 250,000 Palestinian refugees. And the United States actually cut off a loan to Israel in order to try to compel it to change. But because of domestic political pressure, President Truman revoked this sanction and let the loan continue. And that was a signal to Israel that it didn't have to take United States policy pronouncements seriously, that it could disregard what the United States had to say. And so we've seen how that's played out over the decades repeatedly, with Israel simply ignoring what the United States demands.
Thank you, Josh, for that beautiful and detailed summary of this very, very crucial period. Before we move on to Zarefah, you did talk about the partition just briefly there, and I know you can't talk too much about it for the sake of time, but let's assume that the concept of partition was justified. And it wasn't, but let's assume the concept of it was justified. Was the actual demarcation and the implementation of it justified? I mean, the ins and outs of the actual partition agreement itself, the way that it was devised, the way that it was thought of. I know that United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNESCO, when they offered their majority position that Palestine should be partitioned, the actual demarcation itself, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So both the majority and minority reports of UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, were written by an American, actually, Dr. Ralph Bunche, who served in the UN Secretariat. And he considered the majority report for partition and the minority report for federated state to be equally good or equally bad. He was very ambivalent about his handiwork in his journals and in his letters to his wife. But this is something I go through in quite a lot of detail, because I actually read the entirety of the UNSCOP reports in preparation for this dissertation and this book that I'm working on, and it makes no sense. It absolutely makes no sense, because what the majority report of UNSCOP recommended was not the creation of an Arab state and a Jewish state. They recommended the creation of a virtually homogenous Arab state in about 40% of Palestine, and then a binational state in about 55% of Palestine, which would be for the supposed Jewish state. But in this Jewish state, the Zionist movement owned less than 10% of the land and owned less than 7% of all of Palestine. But even the demographics of the demarcation made no sense, because do you know how many Jewish people were in the demarcated territories for a Jewish state? It was 498,000. And do you know how many Palestinians were in these same demarcated territories for a Jewish state? It was 497,000. So you had almost complete numerical parity for what was projected to be the Jewish state. And I think a lot of the blame for the ethnic cleansing that took place belongs to the United Nations for setting up this situation that basically encouraged the ethnic cleansing, because there would have been no Jewish state, even if it had been peacefully agreed upon between the two sides, which it wasn't, without this ethnic cleansing taking place. And another important note to dwell on Tarek, is that the UNSCOP Partition Plan was only a recommendation. The General Assembly can only make recommendations. It cannot compel parties to agree to anything, especially against their will. And this goes back to the self-determination piece, right? So if you read the UNSCOP majority report, it says that this will be implemented only with the consent of both Palestinians and the Zionist movement. And because Palestinians withheld their consent to the partitioning of their country against their will, the partition plan was never implemented. It was this forcible ethnic cleansing campaign that preempted what the UN had recommended and made it completely not only invalid, but just completely impracticable. So the partition plan was never implemented, much less agreed upon by the sides.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I really wanted to drive that point home because when I first studied the partition plan, I always questioned the position of the UN regarding Jaffa, and I said, well, it makes no sense for that area to be part of the Arab state. There's got to be a reason. And then I realized that because it has a population of like 70 to 75,000 or 70 to 71,000 Palestinian Arabs, if you incorporate that into the Jewish state, well, guess what? Now you don't have a Jewish majority in the Jewish state, so it doesn't make numerical sense. The whole thing, yeah. Thank you for that, Josh. And Zarefah, I want to shift gears a little bit here. So the last 77 years have been marked by Israel's consolidation of its gains of what we just been discussing, the events of 1947 to 1949. I want to focus on one aspect here, which is the use of confinement and establishing this carceral space in various aspects within Palestine. Gaza is a prominent example of that right now, but Israeli prisons or dungeons is another mechanism. Right. So how is incarceration incorporated into Israel's ongoing Neckba strategy?
Right. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Tarek, for hosting. And Josh, I'm so excited to read your book. But yes, let me get into this question. So in order to discuss the role of incarceration and carceral practices generally that we're seeing now and that we've seen in the history of the occupation, the history of Israel, within this ongoing Neckba structure, I think it's really important that we first kind of establish and discuss the core tenets of settler colonialism and how then they are inherently connected to Israeli carceral policy during the Neckba era, and how these also persisted throughout Israel and the occupation's history as a tool of colonial maintenance and settler elimination. So one of the most prominent and foundational scholars of settler colonialism or settler colonial studies is, of course, Patrick Wolf, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. But he, of course, built off a framework that was developed first and foremost by Indigenous scholars. But he speaks about how settler societies were designed and are designed and premised on a, quote, logic of elimination, right? So we see how this pans out with genocide, like what's happening in Gaza right now, or with ethnic cleansing operations during the 1948 Nakba until now. We see them happening in real time in the occupied West Bank, throughout the occupied West Bank, Masafar Yatta, Jenin, Tulkarem, all these places. But elimination also happens, I think, in far more many forms, far more diverse forms than we give it credit for. And I think this is particularly relevant to discuss today on Neckba Day, but also as we're receiving the news of the 3 Gazans who had been abducted by the IOF in Gaza during their genocidal military operations, and where last night they were pronounced dead, obviously as a result of torture. So one of the first things, right, that a colonial or settler colonial regime often does when it's captured a territory is to erect a prison. And there's a reason for this. It was 3 days into the 1967 war that Israel resurrected the military court system in the occupied territories. So colonial regimes, but particularly settler colonial regimes across the world, have always found great utility in a prison structure. in a carceral program and framework. But all forms of captivity and punishment also, to subdue, to disappear, to eliminate Native populations. There's a fantastic American scholar, Khalil Hernandez, who speaks about this, but in the context of the United States. And this might sound like a little bit of a diversion, but I promise it's going to connect. But Hernandez talks about how early systems of law enforcement, quote unquote law enforcement, used imprisonment and detention as a means of displacing Indigenous and Black communities. So like with Israel, this history follows us into this present moment. And that means that Indigenous people in the US and Canada and Australia and these settler regimes that continue to be settler regimes continue to be substantially overrepresented in these respective prison systems. And this also means that Indigenous people, this has surprised me, honestly, and I'm ashamed that it surprised me, but Indigenous people are more likely than any other racial or ethnic group in the US to be shot and killed by police. So as we see, like with Israel, how its invasion structure, as Patrick Wolf terms it, follows it into this present moment. We can see the same examples of this happening in the US and Canada and Australia, etc. So like Hernandez argues about in the context of the occupied United States, I argue that Israeli prisons too have played an eliminatory function throughout the occupation and even prior, especially in this Neckba period. So, for instance, as we are commemorating 77 years since the Neckba, we're often, the focus goes to the mass displacements and the massacres that took place. But let's also consider the ways that detention contributed to Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign and continues to do so today. So throughout the ethnic cleansing operations of Plan Dalet, right, Zionist forces also mass abducted and detained Palestinians during these operations. Some who were suspected of being fighters, others abducted arbitrarily to kind of advance this disappearance program of Palestinians, but also to exploit their labor. And I think that this example of the way that the extraction and exploitation of labor during the Neckba manifested is really nefarious, but really fascinating. The way that traditionally colonial and settler colonial objectives intertwined during this period. So they weren't only used, prisons and detention were only used to target Native populations with just confinement, but also the extraction of labor. According to testimonies that were collected by Mustafa Kbaha, who I cited a lot in my thesis, Palestinians were also abducted from their villages and forced to labor in fields, performing agricultural work on land, performing agricultural work at gunpoint on land that had just been stolen from them. And they were also, I think, worse yet, forced to assist Zionist forces in emptying depopulated Palestinian villages, collecting furniture, valuables, clothing of the expelled and massacred populations. And the bits of bedding, blankets, pillows, things of this nature that were left behind, they were then forced to kind of steal from their own neighbors to bring them back to the detention site, many of which were just kind of caged off barbed wire open spaces. So not only was their labor extracted, were they forcibly disappeared, but there was kind of, I think, a psychological elimination that was happening in this way, that they were forced to advance their own erasure through these systems. So while prisons physically eliminate Palestinians through disappearing, through slow executions, via prolonged torture, executions that are, more direct, like the 3 Palestinians abducted from Gaza, who were just pronounced dead in custody last night, I would also like to hear the implanted psychological and spiritual, along with physical elimination, which takes place in these carceral spaces, namely the eradication of the Palestinian psyche through attempts to desecrate and criminalize perceptions of homeland, of honor, of religion. For instance, tactics of torture, such as solitary confinement, which are frequently used by Israel, are operationalized to psychologically debilitate detainees. And I want to focus a bit on solitary confinement because this is one of the things that we've been hearing a lot coming out of these Israeli torture camps throughout the duration of this war or this genocide. Sorry, one moment. So I want to talk about the psychological impact of tactics like solitary confinement. So what does this do to someone? How does this psychologically impact a person when they're left in prolonged isolation? Not to mention the torture, not to mention the ill treatment, or anything else that you can automatically assume about the Israeli prison experience, just solitary confinement. I think it was in 2020, the United Nations officially declared that solitary confinement amounts to torture if it's used for periods of 15 consecutive days or longer. And this 15-day mark is important. After 15 days, according to psychologists, the psychological harm of solitary confinement, of prolonged isolation, becomes irreversible. 15 days. This includes the shortening of one's life, one's ability to retain memory. It actually literally physically shrinks the section of your brain responsible for memory retention. Hallucinations, illusions, paranoia, delirium, suicidal ideation, these types of things. A pertinent example of this is Ahmed Manasra, who we just saw was released in April. He was held in solitary confinement for months on end during his almost 10 years in prison. And as a result, we've seen what happened to him. He developed extreme schizophrenia. Also, Khalil, who was just released in January, was held in solitary confinement for 5 consecutive months. So psychologists say after 15 days, the impacts of solitary confinement are irreversible. It is typical for Palestinian detainees to be left in isolation for months. And during this war, Gerard even mentioned that they were starving her. There were all these other facets of torture that were occurring at the same time in the same space. So since the Neckba, Israel has utilized these same tactics to foster a carceral regime across the occupied territories, which is more and more advanced as detention infrastructure expands, as technological advancements are made, such as security infrastructures and surveillance infrastructure. But subsequently and coordinatedly, it's vital that we mention that resistance inside prison to settler elimination has always been a hallmark of the Palestinian prisoner experience as well, with many detainees organizing across the decades work and hunger strikes to achieve various material gains inside detention, gaining unprecedented leverage against the IPS, the Israeli Prison Service, as well as establishing universities behind bars to educate and train detainees from Tawjihi level to university level courses and studies. So while we've witnessed in this last 19 months, what we've witnessed in these last 19 months is truly unlike anything that we've ever seen. Currently, there are over 10,000, I think it's 10,100 Palestinians captive in Israeli jails, and the number of Gazan detainees is not even known at this point. The torture that they have endured, that we're hearing about incrementally as they're released, is unprecedented in Palestinian history, truly. All of the prison organizing, which has one Palestinian detainee as leverage within the prison, has reportedly been dissolved completely, according to these testimonies of people being released. And there are really, on the IPS's part, there really are no more efforts or attempts at disguising the IPS as anything more but a tool in service of native elimination. So while we witness the ongoing Nakba in Gaza, I think it's important that we don't forget about one of the other major fronts of this genocide that we aren't witnessing at the same level and continues to be deliberately hidden by the IPS. So to finish off, as I encourage all of us and challenge all of us that as our solidarity with the Palestinian people must be uncompromising as ever in this moment, 19 months into a genocide, so must our solidarity with our prisoners. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Zarefah. And I just want to quickly add to that two things. One, the 10,100 political prisoners that you're talking about. There's another word that we can use for them too. And it's a word that our mainstream press has been using, but not referring to Palestinians. And that is the word hostages. They are political prisoners. They are held hostage in Israeli dungeons and have not committed crimes. And believe it or not, more than a third of that number are administrative detainees. So they have not been even offered due process. They lack the basic fundamental guarantees that come with a civil, quote unquote, civil society or civil system. So this is the daily life. This has been the daily struggle of Palestinians living under Israel's brutal military occupation.
Can I make a quick point about this quickly?
Please.
I think that's what you're saying is very important, but I would like to urge us, if we're using this terminology, right, let's also understand that within this settler colonial structure, Palestinians, their existence is their crime. So I don't want to kind of revoke the political agency of our prisoners at the same time and kind of transform them into submissive, passive, because at the end of the day, they're really not. And they're proud of this status of, as people that have posed a threat to the settler entity, right? So I think that that's something that kind of differentiates between this toxic conversation, but I totally agree with you.
Right, but the only reason why I mentioned that is because of the implication that goes with it, the terms that are usually connoted with these terms. You know, innocent versus prisoner. Well, must have committed a crime if you're a prisoner. So this is something for an American audience to properly understand. And you did talk briefly about the now and where we are right now. This can go to both of you, but something interesting that I want to talk about, that we need to talk about. We spent some time talking about the Neckba. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about Neckba denial. Why is it okay for other atrocities throughout the world and throughout history to be a matter of fact and not just a matter of opinion? So it's not, oh, well, there's this view among people here in the U.S. that what happened to Black people was slavery and Jim Crow. No one talks like that. It's what it was. It was slavery and it was Jim Crow and it was racism and it was bad and it was ugly and it was evil and all of that. It's not just a matter of opinion, it's a matter of fact. Why is the Neckba just a narrative? Why can't it just be a matter of fact? Why is it that we have to present it in a way where this is the Palestinian view of it? Why can't it just be ingrained as a matter of fact? I find this to be an interesting type of struggle because because Israel itself, to this day, with all of the literature, Josh, with the new historians, with the plethora of archival information that has come out to showcase that this did not happen by accident, but in fact by design. Why is there still this denial? And there's also this contradictory form of speak. So in the first few weeks of this genocidal campaign since October 7th, there's been calls within the Israeli government for a second Neckba, but they don't even acknowledge the first Neckba. So is that a tacit acknowledgement that what was committed was in fact a Neckba? I want both of you to speak to that. Just the discourse around it. Josh, go ahead.
I think in most cases, oppressors who commit these types of atrocities realize that they cannot brag about it, that they have to try to cover up their tracks. This is something that we see through denialism of the Armenian genocide committed by the Ottoman Empire. This is manifest in current American political discourse of taking books off the shelf that have critical race theory and that try to deny the horrors of the extermination of the indigenous population in this country, the horrors of the enslavement of so many million Africans. So this denialism is certainly not unique to Israel's oppressive regime over the Palestinians, what I find perhaps even more disconcerting than the denialism is the trend that we've seen in recent years in Israeli political discourse. So that now it's not so much that the Neckba is being denied, but an outright owning by so many mainstream politicians that the job wasn't finished in 1948. That, as you allude to, that there needs to be a second Neckba committed against the Palestinians. And we see how Israeli ministers talked over and over again about second Neckba now in October of 2023. We see how in these plans to drive Palestinians out of Gaza and into the Egyptian desert, plans that have been endorsed and greenlit by the Trump administration, we see the same type of eliminatory logic and the ideational notion that Israel should complete this ethnic cleansing process that it didn't finish in 1948. Even Israeli historians of the Neckba, like Benny Morris, for example, who many people mistake as left-wing because he has documented so many of these atrocities. No, he's along these same historiographical lines, that Israel should have finished the job in 1948 and should have taken the opportunity to ethnically cleanse all of the Palestinian people. So to me, the fact that this discourse is now in the open, whereas Israel tried to actually hide the Neckba in 1948 and did not succeed in doing so, to me, it's even more dangerous today than it was 77 years ago.
Right. Can I jump off of this?
Please.
So, I mean, settler regimes throughout history have kind of followed a similar pattern that we can follow with the way that Israel has navigated Neckba discourse. It's common that, I mean, a settler regime, unlike a colonial regime, it wants to implant itself permanently in a space. And in order to do this, you need to gain legitimacy through various ways, especially on the world stage. So a country like Israel, a nation state like Israel that wants to come across as legitimate, as a democracy even, it needs to erase this past. It needs to erase this settler past. It needs to even erase its colonial past. I mean, you'll see kind of this historical revisionism, this historical erasure about the connection between the British and the Zionists and Palestine. And they want to even sever this tie to make themselves look, okay, this is post-colonial Middle East, post-colonial Israel, right? But it's clear that Israel has started to incrementally but escalating abandon this hope that it's going to be seen as legitimate on the world stage. And it feels, even though, Josh, I agree with what you're saying, that it's disturbing that we're seeing. I mean, I just saw the other day Israeli soldiers in Gaza spray painting Neckba. They had spray painted Neckba 2023 on demolished buildings in Gaza. So I think this acceptance in a weird way, in kind of a twisted, distorted way, is also gesturing us towards the reality that Israel is beginning to give up on this idea that it can retain this idea of a legitimate state that's going to be permanent in Palestine. And in a way, I kind of find that hopeful. I think obviously these things are going to be disturbing and they're going to be violent at the climax that we're in Gaza right now. But I think that it could be a sign of hope, actually.
Yeah, Zarefah, I 100% agree. I want to give just a little bit of context before we close about this present moment that we're in. Before the last 19 months, the West Bank was already experiencing its most deadly year since the Second Intifada. So it's not like everything was, it was just this generalized oppressive system where there's just been restrictions of movements, a demolition of a home here and there. No, there was murder, there was violence from the IOF, from the Israeli state, from settlers throughout the occupied territory. So this is not just some recent uptick. And obviously, with the last 19 months, approximately 60,000 Palestinians killed, and who knows, that number could be fivefold by the end of all of this. And they do a full analysis of everyone that was under the rubble, etc. Not a single functioning hospital left in Gaza. There's still violence rampant in the West Bank from settlers and from the Israeli military. And Palestinians are experiencing basic levels of denial still. So the generalized oppressive system still exists, but now it's at its most intense form we've ever seen in the last 77 years. So here in the United States, we've seen the polling data, and we've seen the trends within American public opinion. Is that something that you see as hopeful, something that we can hold on to and say, yes, the change is not coming the way that we want or as fast as we want, but the trend is going in that direction in a positive way, at least on a grassroots level, and then hopefully it'll delve into the political level. Is there any? I want to leave our audience with some words of hope, and to have the sense of confidence that we will be able to make a difference at some point. I mean, look, we have a Palestinian congresswoman, Rashida Tlaib, who's reintroduced the Neckba resolution. So the fact that you can look up on US.gov and see the word Neckba itself, to me, that's something. The fact that you can go on the ICC website and see the name Benjamin Netanyahu wanted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. I'm seeing something happening. It's symbolic at this juncture, but it could turn into something substantive. So I want you both to speak to that on a positive note, and we'll conclude from there. Zarefah, I'll let you start with that.
Sure. Absolutely. I think that the growing support for Palestine and kind of the endurance of our movement in the United States is incredible. And it's unlike anything that we've ever seen. It's unlike anything that my parents' generation has ever seen. I think maybe our generation kind of takes for granted how special and important this moment is, despite everything that we've lost to get to this point. But kind of when I look to my parents and I see their reactions, having been involved in this movement for so long, my dad being a refugee himself, I know that in this moment we are witnessing history, and it's important that we're engaging in the movement with that knowledge that we're going to be looking back at this moment, and it's going to be momentous, as momentous as it is horrific. I think something that I do want to call to and highlight is that the endurance of our movement in the U.S. is not it's not happening in a vacuum. If it wasn't for the endurance and the strength and the resilience and resistance of the people of Gaza and their denial and their rejection of being erased in the face of the world's superpowers, of all of the weapons you can imagine, and refusing to put the camera down, despite Israel going after all of these journalists and murdering all of these journalists. I think that this is what ultimately is fueling our movement in the United States and around the world. So we need to recognize that is the core, and support for them and solidarity with them is the core, and it will ultimately benefit our movement in the long run and keep us going.
Along the lines of what Zarefah mentioned about the settler colonial praxis of Israel and Zionism, I mean, look, Zionism and the state of Israel have been trying to eliminate the Palestinians for more than a century and a half now, and they've not succeeded in doing so. And despite the exceptionally brutal genocidal violence that Israel has inflicted on Palestinians in Gaza over the past year and a half, despite the starvation, Palestinians aren't going anywhere. They're not going to be erased. Israel will not succeed in the settler colonial attempt to erase the Palestinian people from their homeland. And something that gives me hope is the changes that we're seeing in the understanding of the situation in this country. I think, Tarek, that the trend lines are irreversible. I think that for tens of millions of people in this country, their eyes have been opened wide to the vicious settler colonial reality of Israel over the past year and a half. Record numbers of Americans are disgusted by our country's complicity in Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity. On both sides of the aisle, more prominently among Democrats than Republicans, but even amongst Republicans, there are strong numbers who want to see weapons to Israel ended. When you look on the Democratic side, more than 75% of all Democrats want to end weapons to Israel. And I think that this cannot be reversed. Unlike 1948, when information and analysis and pictures and documentation were all so much more difficult to get, that's not the case today. And everyone with eyes and ears and a heart can see what's going on, can see the brutality, and simply realize that there is no two sides to this issue. There's oppressor versus oppressed. There's apartheid versus people who are experiencing apartheid. And I think that what gives me hope is that understanding American history means understanding that policy only typically changes after public opinion has changed and after public opinion has mobilized in the form of what we're doing on a daily basis to demand a change in our policy. That's what brings about the changes that need to occur to end our complicity and our responsibility for Israel's ongoing Nakba against the Palestinian people. And I don't think that this settler colonial project is sustainable in even the medium term. I really don't. So that's what gives me hope.
Guys heard it. He said, "Keep hope alive." So let's remain hopeful. I want to thank both of our wonderful panelists. I can't wait to read both of your dissertations, and I want to tell the audience to stay tuned for next week's announcements about our upcoming convention this Thanksgiving weekend. So please stay tuned for that. And thank you again to Josh and Zarefah, and have a blessed night.